Welcome to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. I'm your host, Lauren Green. Join me as we navigate political communications ups and downs and ins and outs of our day. My guests and I promise to give you the history, the real, and the ideal. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. I'm your host, Lauren Green. After this most recent Supreme Court session, there were two buzzwords that seemed to be on the lips of everyone: Christian theocracy. If you've been listening to my show for a while, then you know that issues of faith are something we discuss, and I wanted to bring in someone who has experienced this personally and professionally. I know Pastor Mann because we attended the same church in Washington, D.C., and were both there the day it was attacked by white supremacists who were upset about our inclusive theology. Fresh from Denver but raised in Oklahoma, Mann has spent a career-long obsession with growing dynamic campaigns and ministries. From a humble beginning of raising funds for a small adoption agency to recently filming the international smash Coming Out Colton, available on Netflix, Pastor Ben considers their top value a commitment to excellence. Presently, they serve as senior pastor at Metropolitan Community Church of the Rockies, part of the MCC network, an international gathering of churches founded within the LGBT community. Here, they share the joy of Christ's vision with an intergenerational, diverse congregation that seeks to serve the marginalized. In addition to this work, they serve as the chaplain at the University of Colorado Hospital, where they counsel and support families in the Transgender Clinic and beyond. Beyond the persistent pursuit of learning and justice, Pastor Ben is pet parent to Aster, their rescue dog, and an avid fan of karaoke. When not working, they enjoy spending time with friends and family, as well as cooking and hosting dinner parties. If they could share one mantra, they would reiterate something that a former boss told them: bloom where you are planted. I'm excited to welcome to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered, Pastor Mann. Hello, Pastor Ben. How are you?
I'm doing well, Lauren. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you. So the way this kind of goes is we're going to kick it off with our school and life segment, where people are going to hear a bit about you and what you do and sort of how you arrived in this place.
Sure. So I grew up in Oklahoma, full-fledged Red Stater, and attended Baylor University for my undergrad, which is the hotbed of Baptist life, the largest Baptist institution in the world, which was a place where it both sparked my understanding of politics, really, for the first time, and my understanding of my faith in conjunction with a sense of justice. And so at that time, I wasn't really out of the closet, really living fully into myself. And so I chose to migrate over into the nonprofit sector, where I have spent the majority of my life in advocacy, almost explicitly in the public health sphere. Until very recently, about 6 years ago, I decided to make the leap from layperson to clergy. Went to seminary, love seminary, and now find myself serving a predominantly LGBTQ plus church, a historically queer church, in a historically queer denomination. And they have located me in Denver, Colorado. It's the Metropolitan Community Church of the Rockies. I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with the MCC all around the world. And I'm also serving as an ethicist and a chaplain at the University of Colorado Hospital. So it's kind of a multifaceted thing. But I've done lots of school. I could, if I sat here and listed all of my schooling, that might bore your listeners, although I am very proud to be studying to become a therapist. So that's like my next iteration of ministry and crossover, is working with families and individuals, especially on trauma. And I work with a lot of transgender individuals as they are seeking their spiritual and psychological nourishment for going through that process.
Absolutely. Understood. And so I appreciate sort of all of the perspectives that you bring to this conversation. But to sort of start with a bird's eye view, like a lot of what we're hearing right now in the media is tied to Christian nationalism, right? So we just got through a really tough Supreme Court session, sort of honestly from A to Z on a host of different topics. And so Christian nationalism and Christian theocracy is becoming this buzzword. And so to sort of give people a crash course, what exactly is that?
Absolutely. Christian nationalism is essentially a misinterpretation of Christian scripture and the upholding of fundamentalist evangelical views on Christianity that promotes this idea that the United States or the developed world should be that all democracies should be actual Christian theocracies, that they should uphold a sense of ethos and morals that reflect those specifically described in Scripture, which is highly dangerous, obviously for a number of reasons, and goes against many of the principles that this country has upheld for centuries now. I come from a family that of where there is Christian nationalism. I know that you, Lauren, come from Texas. I remember during my time at Baylor seeing billboards that, and this was in the late 90s, promoting this concept that God should rule or that Jesus should be our president. And it's a very narrowly drawn, explicit request. And if we're getting really real, it's really the narrative of white, heteronormative, cisgender, wealthy, predominantly in middle class individuals in faith communities that are really boosting this narrative and promoting it and did their work, over the course of the last 50 years, especially with Roe v. Wade. Can't fault them for pursuing their politics rigorously, but I find it highly dangerous and problematic on a number of fronts, both theologically, personally, and politically.
Gotcha. And so while noting all of that, what I think really stuck out to me is the notion of it being a misinterpretation. So what particularly do you think is being misinterpreted?
Sure. So maybe misinterpretation is taking it a step too far, but this is an age-old problem. This is an ancient Christian issue, even before we understood or used that word Christian. If you hearken back all the way to the beginning of the biblical narrative or the Christian, in the Christian Bible, how Christians have organized the Bible, the people of God have always gone through this kind of transference of power and how they understand their power to the state versus their power with and from God. And so there's just this habitual cycle that we go through, and we've never learned. We continue to perpetuate this cycle, and it usually starts with the people of God seeing the opportunity of culture, seeing that they have the opportunity to maybe overwhelm and control culture. God warning them not to do that in the narrative, and saying instead, don't focus all of your attention and on the struggle of maintaining this power, this human power. Give that over to me. Give that attention to me, and live in community, live in service, live in, and that is the actual kingdom, putting the marginalized above the powerful. Of course, the people ignore this directive, do assume control of the state, and there's this is even Old Testament stuff that I'm talking about. God seems to become displeased with that, takes a step back, and allows the world to essentially subsume the people of God, even to the point of slavery, casting them down to the lowest rungs of the societies that they were trying to overwhelm with their power structures. And then the cycle starts over. They become humble. They supplicate. They say, God, you are right. We understand now what this relationship is meant to be. And then God, of course, re-enters the space with them and brings them back to a place of at least safety. And so this is the story of the ancient Israelites, the story of those who followed many times over and over, and has been the story of the Christian church as well, where we have faltered and fallen over the course of the last 1,000 years. And so that's what I think is happening now. We're just entering this time where there's a resurgence of this ancient story happening again, where people who claim that mantle of Christianity are misinterpreting, are not seeing that that's what they're doing, that they're trying to subsume culture, they're trying to control the power structures, because that's nice, right? It's always fun to be in control, to be completely reflected, to have complete ownership and dominance, and these, and these are always long narratives. So this has been building over centuries, right? These stories are not just like 4-year cycles. It's not just one transfer of presidential power to the next. It really is the long game of where until we hit a pinnacle of Christian malfeasance or misdirection, and then that's when everything comes toppling down. So I don't know if I'll see that in my lifetime, understanding that this is a multi-generational problem, that toppling over and that regaining of the principles of Christianity will happen, or that the principles of following Christ will happen. But that's essentially what I think is at the core of Christian nationalism, is this misunderstanding, we're not going to pay attention to what we've been taught, what we understand in Scripture. And we're going to just pursue this opportunity to claim this kind of branding, right? Because people trust that. People tend to trust. I mean, I know that the institution of the church is at its lowest trust level in many decades. But I think inherently, on an individual, one-to-one level, is, speaking as a pastor and a chaplain, the amount of trust I immediately gain by just entering a room or entering a space with people tells me that there's still this like really inherent base level of support of Christianity. So that's where I think we're heading. I think that's where we're at, and I think even in that same story, there are people like you and me, Lauren, who object, who see things differently, who are listening. Some in the story, oftentimes those people are called prophets. They're the ones saying, don't do this, especially if you read the book of Judges. The judges essentially are prophets. They are sent by God. They're being informed. They are seeing things clearly, and they're saying, we cannot do this. Let us help you. Let us, the judges, the prophets, help lead you through what this actually is. And oftentimes those people are not popular. they are frequently pushed down and degraded. They lose focus, which, depending on how you view things now, could be see is the case. When you see the media, for example, being completely degraded on one end, except for Fox News and more extreme versions of Fox News now, like that's an example of that of one voice being clamped down and one voice being lifted up. So I feel like I'm rambling now for you.
No. First of all, I think a lot of that is interesting, right? Because we deal with this dynamic of I guess what I'm referring to very, very roughly and callously as like humility versus power, right? And how, this cycle that it feels like the culture can go through about which is the true representation of Christianity. We know that there are so many perspectives on all the things, because one of the beautiful things about our faith, although I don't think this is captured well, is that it's not a monolith, right? And so many people feel differently on so many issues, but what gets brought in as the Christian perspective is often Christian nationalism, is often, right-wing politics and extremism. And so then the rest of us are kind of left fighting, like, yes, I'm a Christian, but not that Christian. At the same time, I'm not saying all Christians have to be like me, but like, I also think they're wrong, like this weird, like dance you end up doing in an effort to attempt to be inclusive and make room for people to have their own decisions, but also do your best to call out like harmful and toxic behaviors. And so that's sort of the space that I think we're in currently. And as we transition into Hold Up, which is where, I try to talk about an element of something that doesn't get enough discussion. I think two of the Supreme Court decisions that caused the most, I guess, or were attributed largely to Christianity were the prayer in school decision. So there was a decision, I can't remember the name of the case, but a teacher was praying in the middle of the football field during games. And so the decision was that is allowed. And then Dobbs as well, which overturned the Roe v. Wade right to privacy, which was the landmark case on choice and abortion. And so I want to take a second there to say, as Christians, right, like, what are alternative perspectives of that? And I say that, one, because I think it's important to have multiple voices at the table, but also because, growing up in school, I don't know, if I'm honest, I went to public school in Texas for elementary school, middle school, and high school. I don't know that prayer was ever not a thing, right? Like, everything from the moment of silence after the Pledge of Allegiance to things that would happen in class. See you at the poll, FCA. Like, it's this very it was a part of the culture, and so there's this idea that, oh, now we can do this, or, oh, we've been kept from doing this. When in reality, I don't think in certain portions of the country that was ever really taken seriously anyway.
I would totally agree. I think what the dynamicism or the shift that we're going to see is that this kind of, at first, in those, even in those spaces that you just described, Lauren, it was always separate, right? Like, we would pray at the poll. I did that every year. You would pray, you would go off into the library at lunchtime and do Bible study with your like-minded peers. It was always driven by the community or the students and in a separate space. Now it's being put in the middle. Okay. It's being centralized. And essentially, when we do that, we know what that means. It's a tacit endorsement of the institution or the systems around that, is to say, if this coach is allowed to pray on the 50-yard line, then essentially this school, whether it's private or publicly funded, is endorsing that action or that behavior.
Yeah, it's the endorsement that people are looking for as far as an approval. And there is also a power element there, right? So one of the, I guess, underlying notions of Christianity, particularly conservative Christianity, is the notion of binaries, right? You are either 100% with God or walking completely away from God. And so I find, like, emphasis in these areas, right, is in an effort to be, like, on the furthest, like, possible extreme, in a weird way, because that's viewed as, like, the only option available, because anything else would be, like, complete and total separation from. And it's if I'm honest, a little scary, because it ends up creating what I think could really be some hostile spaces for people who don't agree with that.
Well, and again, just speaking theologically, which I think is what you wanted me to do, there's this real difference between, we have to divide this line between prayer and proselytization. And maybe this is something that those arguing against prayer and the prayer case didn't quite understand. There is an argument to be made, at least within Christianity, again, hearkening back to the beginning, that there's a difference between prayer and what we do in public, even if we're speaking to God in public. If you look at, like, Matthew 6, that verse those verses talk about how prayer is meant to be a private thing, that we do it in private spaces, even as far as going into a closet to pray alone. Which makes the sense that in our modern translation, that where we actually pray is kind of that private space. It's where we go and we create a sacred space, which is why we do it in a sanctuary, or we do it one-on-one, or we do it within our family context, because that's where the early Christians were doing that. It was in homes, literally. It was in someone's homes, in private, behind closed doors. That's where you would pray. Those same verses in Matthew 6 actually calls what this football coach is doing a hypocrisy. It would say doing this from the street corner or doing this in public, doing this with a spotlight on what you're doing is faulty and false, and is not what we would call prayer. So there's an argument to be made that what they're actually doing when coaches, teachers, public officials choose to do this from the street corner, 50-yard line, that essentially what they're doing is they're proclaiming what they believe. They're proclaiming their religion, their practice and they're giving language to that, and to endorse that, I think, does violate the Constitution. So it's this interpretation of prayer. Because if it's a prayer, then it's a private religious, instrument. But if it's proselytization, that's a completely. I think that moves it into a completely different area of understanding, and that is backed up by Christian theology.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. I think about public prayer being referred to in that way, because that is also what we see in the larger sphere, period, right? So I don't know if you've ever been, at I guess, celebrations or other events that protesters show up to. Or were you at Calvary in 2017 when protesters came, right? And there's
Yes.
often this large showcasing of prayer, right? This huge, ostentatious like prayers with these awful languages, in an effort to attack and insult people under the guise of prayer. And so that being actually in a completely separate category makes so much sense, because even in the moment you can feel the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely see that. And I mean, it's a. Do you think it's actually like there's any element of this that is actually earnest?
I mean, I think anybody who seeks to pray is often doing that. If I take off my pastor hat for a second and put on my psychologist hat, for a second, there is an expression of need there. There's a desire. I think it emanates from a positive place in someone, but ultimately, there's lots of things that we want to do for people that they may or may not agree to, and we live in a constructed society. We live in a democracy for this very reason, and any behavior, even regardless of its intention, can become toxic, and I think, and so that's, again, I think again, this is more of a move about that earlier conversation about the shift in the story towards Christian nationalism, that it has anything to do with the private, personal intention of this coach, or of those who want to do what he's doing.
I think that's fair, and I do think that can be hard to engage with. In my experience thus far, often when these conversations are attempted to be had, well, I guess even outside of these conversations, I find that faith and I guess adherence to it can be used as a deflection, as in a combination of, oh, this is my faith, so it can't be attacked or it can't be questioned or challenged at all. And on the flips, but also simultaneously questioning yours in the effort you don't agree. So it's that I'm a Christian and I can't be attacked for, having my faith publicly. And also you must not be a real Christian because you don't agree with me. And it's a really, I think, it's a hindrance for earnest and honest communication, which I think therein makes it a hindrance for a true relationship.
Yeah. And another Christian principle that I think gets violated frequently in these debates is the concept of unity, and the fact that we are actually called to come into agreement with one another. It's not always like perfect agreement, but to strive for that connection. And I think some Christians interpret conflict or disagreement as oppression and attack. And, that's just illogical. Christ, every leader of our faith has been attacked or been in conflict, even amongst each other. And it's always part of the process. And I think there's just this like hypersensitivity. I mean, this is essentially, that's patriarchy, right? Is like that kind of limp male need ego to be like, to be seen, to be respected, to be adhered to. That's, and that's unfortunate for those who who need that validation.
Absolutely. And as we transition into I Ain't Sorry, you have, as you noted, done a host of different things professionally and been on your own journey personally as well. And so, what is any type of philosophy you've developed that helps you do the work that you do?
Absolutely. I was reminded several years ago, right before I took over MCC of the Rockies, took over the pulpit, of this. There's a saying that I've morphed out of the civil rights movement, and it essentially says, when things are dark and grim, love your people. And when that doesn't work and people are still letting you down, the systems of oppression are overwhelming you, love your people. And when that doesn't work and you're ready to give up, love your people. And so that I've been telling myself that a lot, especially over the last month or so. I mean, it's been going on for a while, obviously, but that's what I try to do, is to love my people and to focus my
Mhm.
attention there, because I think ultimately that's what I'm called to do, as a pastor, as a human being,
Mhm.
who desires to live in community, is to focus in on the community that has been brought to me, or that in which I find myself in, which isn't always agreement. It's not always, doesn't always look the same, doesn't always behave the way that I want it to behave. But that's what gets me through. And I think that's a mantra that almost anybody, across any identity, could to see, is like, who are your people? Identify those people and then love them, and then spend your time doing that, because that's what makes it all worth it.
Absolutely, absolutely, and the world always needs more love. Always, always, always. And it's important to remember so that love is at the center of what we do. Sometimes, I mean, I can speak for myself. I can be caught up in the busyness of it all. But if
Mhm.
it's the love, then it all becomes like actually very burdensome. So you've
When
got.
you're feeling powerless, I was teaching
Mhm.
a class to a group of first year medical students,
Mhm.
2 weeks, and we were talking about the Roe v. Wade decision to a group of people who are about to enter into situations where they're going to have to help
Yeah,
young people who can become pregnant, or people who are going to become pregnant and don't want to be pregnant,
right.
make those decisions. And talking to them, and they just said, like, we just feel so powerless, like we just don't know what to do. And so, I essentially said that it's like, you've really got to find your community and ground yourself, and really find, who you are at the core, and connect with that, because that's, and get ready, get ready to fight. It's a two pronged. We prepare ourselves, and then we start to battle. And in this case, as doctors, as people who work in a healthcare, space, is like, we've got to just push. We've got to, we're the experts, right? We're the ethicists. We're the people helping people make these decisions. We've got to keep doing our jobs and not be afraid to do that. And so
Mhm.
it's hard, because you want to see young people just thriving, especially medical students, brilliant young people. You don't want them to sit there and just like, we're at a loss, like, you want to see them dreaming, and so that was quite a moment.
Absolutely. Dreaming and aspiring. Yeah, as a student, you're supposed to be thinking about what it would be like to be in the field. And so if you, yeah, I mean, I guess I always imagine myself to be powerful. And so if you feel powerless before you can get started, that's a really rough, where do you even go from there? So I appreciate your work. And keeping that in mind, though, what, if anything, is giving you hope right now?
Sure. I'm going to pause. um, what is giving me hope? I think there are a lot of people doing really critical work that is really inspiring. Um, and that gives me pause, and helps me see that there can be a way through, this evolving mess, this growing mess, that we see ourselves in. I think about one of my dearest friends and colleagues, Heather Lundy, who, has found a model to make mental health care more affordable and accessible, and has expanded. Um, it's called Kesed Wellness, has expanded the reach of that work, beyond Colorado, where it started, and is now in 3 states and growing. Young queer, non-binary, professional, just like making those things happen. And that's always how the movement happens, right? Like those of us who live on the margins, we are often the ones that stem the tide and start the revolution. And so I'm encouraged by these protesters, the young women, singing in the streets, saying, we're not going to allow this to be, we're not going to go back, we're not going to regress. So I do see that, and that gives me hope. And then I just think there's just the internal work of spiritual growth that we all need to do, is just to take pause and to think and to go within ourselves and say, like, what in me is speaking to me right now, and how best can I be of service? And there's plenty that we can each do. And so I've always prided myself in my work. I might be a little bit of a workaholic. That's for my therapist to deal with, but it's there. I think it's all within us. We have all that we need. We just need guidance and leadership. And as I see leaders taking those steps forward, including you, Lauren, I think facilitating voice, telling story, supplementing media that's just not getting out there. I think this is really critical.
Thank you. I think that all of that is very important. And I appreciate that last piece of we have all that we need. I think we can forget that. Often in a lot of spaces I work in, and I imagine you work in too, you feel out-resourced, out. You don't have the bandwidth, staff-wise, you don't have this, you don't have that. All of the lack is what feels like is an abundance. But it's important to remember we do have all that we need, which is the resolve to get it done. And so that is so important. And in an effort to lift voice, I want to join you really quickly on that last question about what's giving me hope right now. I read it was I guess a question submitted by a girl. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept on Reddit, but it was, am I the asshole? And so people submit stories from their perspective and question whether or not they were wrong ethically, effectively. And this girl in particular started a what she called a hoe union at her college, which is where the girls, it started, just like with her and some friends, and then expanded maybe to her dorm. But they put together a group chat with a list of qualifications. They said, no transphobia, no homophobia, no body shaming, no, sexual assault, all these things. And if you go to a party and this happens to you, you text the group chat and we're all leaving. We're all leaving in solidarity with you because you've been mistreated. And so it expanded across campus to the point that fraternities were upset, right? Because an action would happen at the party, and then the party was over because all the girls would leave because they were upset. And,
sorry, because sexual assault was no longer an option. Sorry.
Right, exactly. But no, first of all, I find it to be incredibly brilliant on so many levels. And just like a level of solidarity between people that I think is so important, especially at that age and all of that. But what actually was most disheartening was the administration of the university said she wasn't allowed to do that, and actually clamped down on her and said that she, was not acting properly. And I think, being a young girl or a young person who wanted to do this, she sort of submitted this question into the internet and the universe to question if she was wrong. And effectively, I've never been prouder of someone I don't know, right? Everything from the idea that, it's one thing to have that solidarity between friends, but the idea that movement between marginalized people across a campus like that, and then to get the action or interaction she received, I want to put out there is like, one, wherever you are, I hope you hear this, and that know that I am very proud of you. And on top of that, know that the response you got was because they understood the power of that moment. Like in the event that had been innocuous or didn't matter, no one would have said anything. But you received the level of pushback and frustration from the powers that be that did, because they understood the power you were holding in that moment. And that's what's very, very important.
Yeah, you're doing things right when you get instant criticism.
Absolutely.
And I'm proud of you too, young person. I would love to meet you and help you the best that I can.
Yeah.
That's powerful. And I want to talk to these administrators and know what they were influenced by. Was it the name? Was it the idea that um, you don't want this topic being so
I
publicly talked about? I mean, that's
I had
crazy.
so many questions because I also think on the like, what is the opposing argument? You must stay in a place where you're being body shamed. Like, this is happening at parties and you must remain there. That makes no sense. But I do want to thank you, Pastor Ben, for coming on today and sharing so much of your wisdom with us. In the event
Sure.
people want to keep up with you, what's the best way that they do that?
Yeah, I have Instagram at Queer Pastor Ben, or you can visit mccrockies.org, which is our website. I occasionally post brilliant blog posts. You can contact the church for support, and there are links to local and growing resources. And so that's if you're in the Colorado region and need support, we're here for you. And so it starts very local, but we will expand into the fight.
Absolutely. If you'll give me one moment to wrap up here.
Sure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. If you are looking for the show, you can find us at Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered on Facebook and Instagram, and you can find all episodes at unbossedunbotheredandunfiltered.com.